Hello listeners, you are welcome to this video course, Procurement Management. We are going to have a look at Module 3, which is entitled Sourcing Strategy and Supplier Relationships. So in this module, you are going to have a knowledge of the various sourcing strategies and also the various models of our supplier relationships. As usual, my name is Dr. Usman Abbas, and I'm going to take you through the various strategies and models. So one fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is whether to source locally or to source globally. So the issue here is that as a company, we actually need raw material components in order to carry out our daily operations. But however, we need suppliers to actually provide us with these raw materials or components. And the issue here is, are we to source for these suppliers locally, or we are to source for them globally? So in this case, we need to look at so many factors, such as the case of costs, quality, and the issue of even capacity. So at the end of this module, you should be able to explain what a sourcing strategy and customer supplier relationship is all about, because we are dealing with two issues here. First is the sourcing strategy that we are supposed to employ, and the kind of relationship we are supposed to maintain with our suppliers. So in this case, the sourcing strategy structure might be just a single strategy, a multi-sourcing strategy, or other forms of sourcing strategy. And you should also be able to discuss on the various sourcing strategies appropriate at different procurement situations. Then you should also be able to explain the Kraljic model, portfolio model of the 1983, and the characteristics and appropriate strategies for the four Kraljic categories. Now, you should also be able to explain the Fagel et al.'s 2010 revised Kraljic model, and you should be able to discuss on interaction model, supplier partnerships, Sarko's 1992 three types of trust, progression of trust over time, partnership definitions, and Cousins relationship portfolio model of 2002. So the sourcing strategy concerns deciding how to configure the supply network. So in these particular slides, we are going to assess four key sourcing approaches. That's the multiple sourcing, the parallel sourcing, the single sourcing, network sourcing, and the triadic sourcing. So concerning the multiple sourcing, it involves obtaining a product or service component from more than one supplier. It is commonly seen in competitive markets where switching costs are low and performance objectives are primarily focused on price and dependability. So multiple sourcing can help maintain competition in the supply market, reduce supply risks, and increase flexibility in the face of supplier failure or changes in customer demand. So in addition, some firms they like to multi-source to prevent supplier dependence, thus allowing for changes in purchase volumes without the risk of supplier bankruptcy. So however, the disadvantage of multiple sourcing is that it becomes hard to encourage supplier commitment, and as such it limits the opportunity to develop a partnership approach to supply management. So when we move to single sourcing, it involves buying all of one product or service component from a single supplier. Often these components represent a high proportion of total spend or are of strategic importance. So in other cases, however, firms simply prefer the simplicity, okay, and reduce transaction cost of single sourcing. So many single source arrangements have a longer term focus than multiple sourcing arrangements, and focus on a wider range of performance objectives. However, single source arrangement can carry an increased risk of lock-in and a reduction in the firm's bargaining power. But when we actually move to the parallel sourcing, you will discover that it has the aim of providing the advantages of both multiple sourcing and single sourcing simultaneously. It involves having single source relationships from components or services for different product models or service packages. But if a supplier is deemed unsatisfactory, it is possible to switch to the alternative supplier who currently provides the same component but for a different model. So the advantage of this sourcing approach is that it maintains competition and allows for switching. However, managing parallel sourcing arrangement is relatively complex. So we can see from the slides that the focal firm supplier collaboration and supplier competition, we can see accepting some level of dependency and risk, but there is a backup supplier at hand. Now, in the case of the network sourcing, it actually involves using multiple suppliers for groups of similar components and distributing volumes to the best performing supplier. So it actually combines the benefits of single and multi-sourcing strategies by enabling both cooperation and competition. So network sourcing strategy focuses not only on the dyadic level between the buyer and the direct suppliers, but also considered indirect suppliers and how this collaborates amongst themselves. So another sourcing strategy is the triadic sourcing strategy, and this strategy seeks to capture the best of both worlds of cooperation and competition. But the distinctive features of the triadic sourcing is that the buyer actively creates interdependencies between two suppliers. So here we can actually say that the concept of network sourcing shifts the focus from dyadic to supply chain or network. At the dyadic level, network sourcing relies extensively on parallel or dual sourcing, and this structure is continued or cascaded beyond the dyadic into sub-tier suppliers. So in addition, suppliers are brought together by the focal firm to share knowledge and transfer best practice. So the triadic sourcing again focuses on direct suppliers and does not consider indirect or sub-tier suppliers. Like network sourcing, the recent concept of triadic sourcing allows for collaboration between the two dual suppliers, but in triadic sourcing, this collaboration is taken a step further through focal firm initiated interdependencies between the three parties. For example, where in a network sourcing there is some sharing of knowledge between suppliers, in triadic sourcing the two suppliers may jointly develop components for the focal firm and thereby create operational interdependency. So this slide shows a Kraljic portfolio model, and from the model we can actually see the y-axis represented by importance of purchase, and then we can see the x-axis represented by supply risks or difficulty, and in the figure we can actually see 4 boxes. The first one, which has leverage, and the items you can find within that particular box are travel services, which actually have a high level of importance of purchase and lower supply risks or difficulty, and beneath it we actually have non-critical items, which might include things like stationery, bolts, and screws. And at that particular level, at that particular box, we can see such items actually have a lower level of importance of purchase, and a lower level of supply risks. Then the third box actually represents strategic items, and from there we can see things like engines, major subsystems can be found there. And with that we can actually see that items found there actually have high level of importance of purchase, and high level of supply risks or difficulty. Then under it, beneath it, we actually have bottleneck items such as recycled textiles, and items within this category actually have high level of supply risks and low level of importance of purchase. So the most widely applied purchasing portfolio model is the model developed by Kraljic in 1983, which specified that purchasing and supply management decisions be taken according to the levels of first, supply market complexity, and then second, importance of purchase. So later adaptations of the Kraljic model have modified the two dimensions into supply risks and profit impact. So the latter opting in practice translated into value. So purchase items should be ranked, for example, as low and high, or using 1 to 10 scores on each dimension, and then be plotted across the 4 boxes. So appropriate measures should be identified for the 2 dimensions. This might be cost and impact on profitability on the y-axis, and number of suppliers, which could be a low number representing high supply risks, and product novelty of complexity for the x-axis. So in addition to emphasizing the need for differentiated strategies for each box, Kraljic in 1983 also made the point that whereas companies tend to focus on the non-critical items, they should dedicate much time to the other items which are more challenging, especially strategic items. Hence the title of Kraljic's article, that's purchasing must become supply management. So the 4 boxes, that is purchase situations, require 4 different strategies as indicated by each box. So Kraljic in 1983 actually suggested that non-critical items were the responsibility of purchasing, bottleneck items needed a focus on sourcing, leverage items require materials management, and strategic items supply management. So in his vision, therefore, supply management was a strategic activity. The concept of management is used to this day in North America to reflect a strategic function, whereby the combined concept of purchasing and supply management, as we see here, is often used in Europe to encapsulate both tactical and strategic activities. So non-critical items are relatively simple to actually manage, but purchasing managers should be careful not to waste time and money on transactional activities, as transaction costs such as searching for suppliers and negotiating with this could easily be higher than actual item cost. So the focus therefore should be on efficiency. And bottleneck items represent low purchase importance but high supply chain risks. So this is a tricky situation because although the item is of low importance, it is still likely to create significant problems if it cannot be sourced. The challenge here is therefore to actually explore alternative sources or to create safety stocks. And finally, leverage items allow for the company to exploit its bargaining power, and as these are high cost or value items, this is an important task. So whereas Kraljic 1983 basically prescribes diversification for bottleneck items, the advice is for full exploitation of power for leverage items. So non-critical and strategic items could be characterized by different buyer supplier power balances, but again the buying company should seek a position of power and explore it where possible. So in these slides, the table is portraying the characteristics and the appropriate strategies for the four Kraljic categories. That's the non-critical supply situation, the leverage, bottleneck, and strategic. So the table basically characterizes each of the four supply situations and the typical strategies for managing these categories. And we can actually see we have the non-critical situation there, we have the leverage, the bottleneck, and the strategy. And each of these categories has some characteristics and appropriate strategies. As we can see, we have the main sourcing focus. For instance, in the case of the non-critical supply situation, we can actually see that multi-sourcing can actually be explored, because we can actually focus on efficient processing and reduction of admin costs and time. But when it comes to strategic supply situation, in that case, simple or parallel source can actually be explored. And another strategy is the issue of make or buy, and the issue of number of suppliers, the issue of supplier relationships, the issue of price and cost negotiation, the issue of supplier assessment and development policy, the early supplier involvement, and the issue of substitution policy and risk management, and the required information. So for each of these four categories, you discover that there is an appropriate strategy that a company or a supply chain can actually adopt. Like when it comes to the number of suppliers, we can actually see that in the case of non-critical supply situation, we can use many, but possibly few global service providers. But when it comes to strategic supply situation, we can actually see that quite a few suppliers by nature being explored, and we actually need to look out for few suppliers. So if you look at the table very well, you can see some strategies that are most appropriate for the four categories. So from this slide, we can actually see the revised Kraljic model of 1993. But in this case, Pagel et al. In 2010 actually revised the Kraljic model. And from the y-axis, we can see the triple bottom line importance from sustainability perspective, and from there we can actually see the economic perspective, the environmental perspective, and social perspective. While from the x-axis we can see supply risks. From the economic, that's it, from the triple bottom line perspective. So we can see the low and high level, and on the other hand we can also see at the y-axis the low and high level. So one thing we need to actually ask ourselves is whether the Kraljic model of 1983 is actually compatible with a focus on sustainability, and if not, can it be modified? So one thing we need to understand is there are so many calls for incorporation of sustainability in every aspect of our supply chain, especially in logistics and procurement activities. And when we talk about this sustainability, we also talk about sustainable development. That how can we actually achieve our own needs without compromising the needs of the future generation? And we believe that this can actually be achieved through the application of the triple bottom line of economic, environmental, and social perspective. So whatever we're doing, we need to incorporate the issue of sustainability in logistics activities, in procurement activities, and other activities within the supply chain. So from here we can actually still see the non-critical supply situation. We can actually see bottleneck and strategic, but in this revised model we can actually see that the leverage part of it has been divided into three. You can actually see through commodity, transitional commodity, and strategic commodity. So in order to answer this, Pagel et al. In 2010 actually evaluated the Kraljic model in the light of the need to actually create sustainable supply chains, suggesting that the horizontal dimension, that's the importance of purchase, is purely focused on economic importance. So from a sustainability perspective, the importance of purchasing an item should also include an assessment of importance in terms of its impacts on the triple bottom line, that's economic, environmental, and social impact. So on the other hand, he actually suggests that, or they actually suggest that the vertical dimension is still a question of supply chain risks, but a triple bottom line focus implies that these are not only economic but also environmental and social. So if, for example, a supplier does not comply with the company's standards for labor conditions, it indicates a high supply risk. But interestingly, although the supply chain risks literature has grown significantly over the last few years, undoubtedly, a response to frequent supply chain disruptions, environmental and social risks tend to be considered at all for future at the bottom of the list priorities. So at the bottom of our actually list of priorities. So from the figure, we can actually see it actually shows the revised Kraljic model where both dimensions actually focus on sustainability. So the non-critical, bottleneck, and strategic remain as in the original model, but the assessment of what places items into those categories should depend on the levels of risks and impact from a triple bottom line perspective. So the leverage category is divided into three subcategories, and these include true commodities, as you can see, and transitional commodities and strategic commodities. So in the case of true commodities, basically the same as in the original leverage item, which is not the same, but although the item has a high impact only on one element of the triple bottom line, those item cost of price is still critical, although social or environmental issues should also be considered. Then in the case of the transitional commodities, items with temporarily high supply risks, for example, due to lack of compliance with or lack of information required to assure the buyer's sustainability requirements, once corrected through supplier assessment and development, this can revert to the true commodity subcategory. But for the strategic commodities, critical commodities that transcend, it can refer to actually critical commodities that transcend simple market economics. So strategic commodities have non-economic attributes that could be leveraged into a long-term competitive advantage. And so in addressing the same question, Kraljic et al. Of 2009 actually proposed for each of those four categories that for example, strategic items required close supplier partnerships, for instance, to ensure the collaborative products and process development. So these efforts should actually include sustainability. In particular, buying organizations should consider collaborating and cross-fertilizing their know-how with suppliers of strategic items in order to minimize the environmental and social impacts of new products. So supplier partners should be encouraged to actually adopt sustainability as one of their own competitive priorities. So in the case of leverage items, packaging suppliers are typically leverage suppliers. So sustainability should be imposed in such supplier relationships. For example, greater emphasis on the use of recyclables and material reduction. Again, these suppliers should place the same requirements on their own suppliers. But in the case of the bottleneck items, given the high level of supply risks, the buyer is likely to be in a position of low power, and therefore we find it difficult to influence suppliers. Okay, pushing suppliers for sustainability will thus be more problematic. Sorry, will be more problematic. So in this case, Cruz et al. Of 2000 actually suggests that in this situation, buyers could instead try to develop or promote industry-wide standards and norms that are conducive to sustainability. One example would be of hospitals pulling their power to actually certify responsible waste management, service companies, processes, and equipment. So these Cruz et al. Of 2009 actually argued that Kraljic focus on cost and risk minimization contradicts the idea of sustainability for bottleneck items. But for the case of non-critical items, buying companies should use their power to enforce compliance with sustainability criteria. So there is likely to be a good choice of suppliers offering items. So if any of these do not comply with the buying company's sustainability requirement, they should not be actually returned. So comparing the suggestions for each category of Cross et al. 2009 with the revised model and suggestions by Pagel et al. Of 2009, one sees much consistency, even if Pagel and his colleagues suggest that the leverage items in the traditional sense become rarer and need to be divided into three subcategories. So overall, the message is clear. Fundamentally, Kraljic's 1983 model and the categories still apply from a sustainability perspective, but the two dimensions of the model need to take into account not only economic but also social and environmental issues. So what is more, a focus on sustainable sourcing strategies further emphasizes the need to shift the focus from items or commodities to the suppliers that supply this. So this is the interaction model which was adopted from Hankerson of 1982, and we can see the model has two sides: the supplier side and the customer side. And actually, we believe in the long run, we actually exchange goods, we exchange money, we share information and knowledge. And in the long run, in terms of long-term adaptations, we can actually see risks and reward sharing. There is strategic alignment and sustainability compliance, because we believe as time goes on, one of the two parties can actually make the order to comply with the issue of sustainability. And there's relationship atmosphere as time goes on. We need to build trust, and there is power and dependency between the two parties: commitment, cooperation and conflict, and mutuality. So the figure is a contemporary version of the original model, where the main parts of the model are identical to the original, but where parts have been simplified and examples are consistent with current practice. So the model distinguishes between short-term exchanges and long-term exchanges within relationships that is socialize and adapt to each other. So short-term exchanges can involve product or service, information, financial, and or social exchange. Long-term adaptations happen, for example, when the two parties develop strategically in the same direction, that's a strategic alignment, or when engaging in long-term sharing of risks and reward sharing engage arrangements. So adaptations are often highly specific to the counterpart of the little use counterpart and of little use in other relationships. So institutionalization implies that processes over time become systematized and routinized, and in the long run, such adaptations and institutionalization may blur the boundary between the two parties as they reflect and resemble each other in many ways. So all relationships require investment, not least supplier relationships, and efforts to evaluate and develop supplier capabilities can be seen as part of long-term adaptation and routinization processes. So a relationship evolves over time as the two parties interact with each other. The exchanges are not discrete and independent, but part of a long-term process of relationship creation. So exchanges actually take place between two participants, and the model differentiates two levels of actors, that's our organization and individual. So clearly this is a major simplification when considering the number of intra-organizational authorities and stakeholders that characterize complex organizations, but the separation helps one to understand how individuals and sometimes internal departments and functions may have their own aims and experiences which may affect their behavior and performance, and in turn pull the relationship in different directions. Although it is possible to describe an overall company to company relationship, in reality, relationships are also between the individual employees and departments within the companies. So, the interaction model further incorporates a relationship atmosphere. In the original model, the atmosphere was described in terms of the power dependence relationship between the parties, the level of conflict and cooperation, overall closeness or distance, and mutual expectations. So, in the adaptation of the model as shown, trust is added as it is now widely considered a critical aspect of relationship atmosphere. So the original model included a relationship environment consisting of market structure, dynamism, internationalization, position in the manufacturing channel, and social system. So these are valid to this day, although the terminology for this may be different. The interaction model is useful for describing and understanding key features of dyadic buyer-supplier relationships that are between two actors, on the basis that these form the basic building blocks of supply chains networks. So although the model does not specifically focus on sustainability, as we discussed in the previous slides, the variables of the model could certainly include aspect of sustainability. So in particular, when a firm requires a supplier to actually comply with its sustainability requirements, it is a form of adaptation, and there is clearly a need for institutionalization of sustainability practices within buyer-supplier relationships. And besides, if a firm wishes to monitor and implement sustainability practices within a supplier's business, it requires the right sort of atmosphere, as the firm needs to be it actually needs to be in a position of power, and the two parties need to be willing to share information which is potentially controversial. So trust and commitment are important. Imposing sustainability on a supplier could, of course, also create friction and conflict, and thereby a very different atmosphere. So this slide is about supplier partnerships, and changes in procurement and supply management practices during the last couple of decades have changed the way that firms manage supplier relationships. So in any case, it is not so much what a firm says that matters, but what it actually does and how it goes about it. But unfortunately, the partnership metaphor is sometimes used very loosely, to the extent that it ceases to be meaningful. Therefore, a better understanding of the definitions of partnerships is required. So in brief, definitions of buyer-supplier partnership share a number of important ingredients, and these include shared goals, mutual benefits, long-term commitment, trust, and open sharing of information. So in the case of shared goals, various terms may be used for it, comprising strategic alignment. So a partnership requires that the two parties seek to develop in the same direction. But in the case of mutual benefit, sometimes which is sometimes expressed as risks and reward sharing. So mutuality concerns the extent to which a company is prepared to relinquish its own goals for the sake of a relationship. So mutuality implies that there are common goals and interests that bind companies in a shared purpose. But in the case of long-term commitments, the parties stick to the relationship even through difficult times. So commitment implies a lasting intention to build and maintain a long-term relationship. And lastly, in the case of trust and open sharing of information, so trust is often regarded as essential ingredient of successful partnerships, but it's difficult to actually define. So in the next slide, we are going to see how this trust develop over time, how it progresses over time, and we're gonna have a better understanding of trust. So this slide shows Sarko's 1992 three types of trust, and she has actually explained what a contractual trust, competence trust, and goodwill trust are all about. So this has to do with how trust actually develops over time, and for us to actually see the progression, we need to actually understand how these trusts are and what they mean. So the first one there is actually contractual trust. That's the trust that the other party will adhere to the explicit and implicit points of the contract as agreed. So in this case, it means at the initial level, what companies are actually interested in is to develop a kind of contractual trust, a trust whereby the company believes that the supplier will actually deliver the contract based on the terms and conditions. Then the next type of trust is competence trust. As we know, as time goes on, when we or the company has seen that the supplier is able to comply with the terms and conditions of the contract, the next thing is to see how that party is competent enough to keep delivering. And then when it comes to specialization, how competent is the supplier, then in terms of what the contract actually requires. Then when the supplier is actually competent over time, now it will mature to partnership. Okay, and when it matures to partnership, it will reach a point that the supplier will deliver beyond expectation, beyond what has been agreed upon. So the goodwill trust has to do with actually the trust that the other party will perform tasks in excess of the agreed terms and conditions. So this has to do with reputation, unlike in the case of the competency trust, which is the trust that the other party has the ability or competence to be able to produce what the contract requires. So this goodwill trust has actually matured to partnership, and in this, what matters is just to help one another whenever there's problem. There is this kind of collaboration that the supplier and the company has a goodwill trust. So whenever they are in problem, they will actually collaborate and get out of that problem. So from this slides, we can actually see how trust progress over time. So it's actually from the study of Sacco in 1992. So we can see at the initial stage we have a new relationship, and we have our contractual trust there, and as time goes on, we have a competence trust, and then at the mature stage, we actually have a goodwill trust. So actually, you know, when we actually select a new supplier from the pool of suppliers, there is that thinking that the supplier is competent enough, and we will have a contractual relationship between the company and the supplier. However, what we are looking at that stage is compliance to the terms and conditions of the contract. So it's just about fulfillment. But as time goes on, we actually need to see competence in terms of delivery, in terms of compliance, and then with time, if the supplier is actually competent enough, the supplier will actually develop a goodwill, and that has to do with reputation. So actually, contractual trust is a kind of trust that the other party will adhere to the explicit and implicit points of the contract as agreed. Then when it comes to competence trust, the that's the trust that the other party has the ability or competence to be able to produce what the contract actually requires. But from the other side, the goodwill trust is the trust that the other party will perform tasks in excess of the agreed terms and conditions. So as the relationships are actually developed, the supplier will need to prove that it has the competence to fulfill its promises. For example, in relation to delivery on time and quality standards. So this has to do with actually competence trust. But as the relationships mature and become a partnership, it is the willingness to actually help each other out of difficulties that counts. So trust can be a difficult concept to actually apply in business context where contracts may seem more important. But nevertheless, trust is an important ingredient in successful partnerships and a key factor in preventing opportunistic behavior by the party. So where formal contracts provide a legal mechanism for companies to fall back on, trust is an informal and social mechanism. So in essence, using a trusted supplier is typically expressed in terms of using a safe pair of hands. So as such, trust is equivalent to confidence. So these particular slides, it's about partnership definitions, and we can actually see different definitions from different authors, like that of Moore and Speckman of 1994, where they define it as purposive strategic relationships between independent firms who share compatible goals, strive for mutual benefit, and acknowledge a high level of mutual interdependence. So based on this definition, we can actually see that partnership, it's all about strategic relationship, and this relationship is between two companies that are independent and their goals are common. They share a common goal, and they are all striving for mutual benefits. Okay, and they acknowledge a high level of mutual interdependence. They are interdependent with each other. But from the other hand, we have another definition from Elram and Henrik of 1995, where they actually define a partnership as an ongoing relationship between two companies that involves a commitment over an extended time period and a mutual sharing of information and the risks and rewards of the relationship. So in this, we can actually see that the issue of risks and rewards sharing has been incorporated, and it's actually an ongoing relationship which is actually extended over a time period, But on the other hand, we have a definition from Partnership Sourcing Limited in 1993, which says that partnership sourcing is a commitment by customers or suppliers, regardless of their size, to a long-term relationship based on trust. So trust here is very important, and on a clear, mutually agreed objectives. So common objectives are here, so they are mutually agreed to strive for a world-class capability and competitiveness. So if you look at these three definitions, it has to do with a strategic relationship, and it's all about collaborations, the issue of collaborations, because we know collaboration actually increase our capacity, and it will help us in making the supply chain very strong. So this takes us to the next slides, where we are going to actually see a relationship portfolio model. So this is a relationship portfolio model which was actually adopted from Kraljic of 2002, and from the model we can actually see the y-axis actually represents the level of dependency, and the x-axis represents a level of confidence. So as we discussed in the previous slides, as trust progress, it increases the level of confidence, and if a company is to actually depend too much on its supplier, then it means there should be high level of confidence. So each of these is categorized into four, and at the A category we have the opportunistic behavior, and the B category we have traditional or adversarial relationship kind of relationship, and at the C category we have the tactical collaboration, and D we have strategic collaboration. So each one of them, like in the case of B, we have low level of dependency and low level of confidence. So it means one is independent, but the level of trust is not that much, because the level of confidence is not much there. But when we move to the category, that's the strategic collaboration, we can actually see that there's mutual dependency. And in that case, there's high level of confidence and dependency between the parties. So whereas the Kraljic 1983 portfolio model provides a way for companies to devise different ways of managing purchasing and supply management according to purchase items, a related issue is to analyze the portfolio of supplier relationships. Clearly, supplier relationships vary greatly, and it is very important not to think of all supplier relationships as partnerships. So only a relatively small proportion of a firm's suppliers are usually considered as partnerships, regardless of the level being used to describe this. So firms need to match the desired performance outcome with the appropriate relationship type. Although partnerships are becoming increasingly important, not all partnerships will necessarily be long-term or strategic, such as when buying low-value, repeatable commodity items. And so it is tempting to consider supplier relationships simply in terms of two extremes, as short-term adversarial relationships and long-term partnerships. However, as discussed previously, a range of other relationship dimensions means that relationships vary according to many different dimensions. So any attempt to describe relationships along simple dichotomies will be oversimplistic. Since the early 1980s, some firms have therefore implemented relationship portfolio strategies like that of Kraljic. They include two dimensions, but they focus on relationships instead of items, and they may help procurement and supply managers to avoid falling into the trap of developing the wrong type of relationship in the wrong circumstances. For example, to our partner, we are not peaceable, So relationship portfolios describe multiple relationships along typically two dimensions, enabling differentiated relationship management strategies in terms of balancing relationship investment relative to partnership intensity or criticality. So from the figure, we can the figure actually shows a relationship portfolio model design around two dimensions. That's a level of confidence and level of dependence. So the horizontal axis is essentially about the level of trust in the supplier, because as discussed earlier, trust is equivalent to confidence. So confidence signifies a high level of trust, whereas unconfident signifies a low level of trust. So the practical axis is about dependency and therefore also about power. So at the top of the model, there is a further dimension, one-sided dependency and mutual dependency. So if a relationship is one-sided, it means that one party is dependent on the other, but not the other way around. So as suggested in the top left-hand box, this could lead to opportunistic behavior and therefore a risky situation. So if, as suggested by the top right hand corner, the high level of certainty were combined with mutual dependency, this will be an appropriate situation to develop strategic supplier relationships. So interestingly, the boxes end up quite similar to Kraljic, but as a Kraljic analysis will reveal very little about the state of supplier relationships, this model is a useful supplement to a Kraljic portfolio analysis, as it provides further insight into relationship conditions.